In 1897, two adolescent boys went swimming off a decaying dock in New York City. They came across a brightly wrapped package floating in the water as they moved around the water. It was quite large, and the paper that covered it was red oilcloth with gold stars on it. They were able to guide their find over to the bank and drag it out of the water. They dashed out and began unwrapping their lucky find. When the paper was removed, they realized their error. Inside were a pair of arms and the upper half of a torso that had been cut in half a few inches below the pectoral muscle. A small patch of skin had been sliced from the area just under the left side of his chest on closer inspection. They called the cops, and thus the story of New York's jigsaw murder began. The next piece of the human puzzle would be discovered the following day by two boys out picking berries with their father. This package, like the first, was wrapped in the same bright red oilcloth with small gold stars. The boys and their father would discover the lower half of the man's trunk when they unwrapped this unlikely find. When police lined up the first and second halves of the body, they discovered that they lined up perfectly with each other, even the oilcloth. The only things that were missing were the head and the legs. A group of sailors stationed on the USS Vermont in Brooklyn Navy Yard would discover the latter. They had spotted the bright red oilcloth bobbing in the water, and the cuts matched up with the previous two sections of our victim. The legs, on the other hand, were cut in a very non-surgical manner, in contrast to the previous sections, which showed medical-like precision. All the police needed now was a head to help them figure out who this man was. At the time, the authorities were not the only ones attempting to solve the case. The city's many newspapers and their excellent reporters were searching high and low for clues and witnesses that would not only identify the deceased but also the person responsible. So far, the only information available was from sections of the man's body. They knew he was in near-perfect physical condition, but his hands bore no resemblance to those of a man prone to physical labor. In fact, they were quite small, and his fingernails had been trimmed close, which was unusual for those in the upper crust of society at the time. He was also pale. Many people interpreted these as hints as to what the man did for a living, believing that revealing this would eventually lead to those responsible. The correct response was eventually provided by a young reporter named Ned Brown who worked for World. He assumed the man was one of the hundreds of masseurs who worked in the city's bathhouses. He correctly assumed that the physique was due to the numerous massages he gave every day, while the lack of sun-kissed skin was due to his inability to get outside. Armed with his assumption, he began canvassing the city's Turkish baths. It didn't take him long to locate one such location where a masseur had gone missing. When he arrived at his fifth location, he was informed that a man named Willie Guldensup had left work on Friday and hadn't returned. When he asked for a description of their missing man, he was given one that matched the corpse's description. Willie also had a tattoo on the left side of his chest, according to Brown. The Intrepid report attributed this to the missing piece of skin, assuming the killer had removed the identifying mark in the hopes of concealing an identity further. Now that the victim had likely been identified, he decided to pay a visit to where the young man lived. Augusta Knack greeted him when the door was opened. They'd been seeing each other for quite some time. Despite this, Knack had been having an affair with another man, Mr. Fred Thorne. He'd become an irritant to Willie, as his surname suggests. The masseur had threatened Fred, scaring him away, only for him to return and sleep with his lady while he was at work. After all, the police arrested Knack and Thorne, but proving the two killed Willie and dismembered his body was a different story. Then came the story's hero, the duck. In the Woodstock neighborhood, there was a man who happened to be the owner of a white duck. That pure white duck returned home one day, its feathers drenched in red. The man was intrigued by what had occurred and decided to follow his pet the next day in the hopes of having his question answered. He discovered a small pond with blood-red water. The duck had led him, and thus the cops, to the crime scene. When Knack was confronted with the evidence against her, she appeared to become more cooperative in the hopes of receiving a less severe punishment. The two devious lovers had devised a scheme in which Knack lured the unsuspecting Willie to a house in a remote suburb with the intention of discussing the possibility of establishing a prostitution ring. Thorne, on the other hand, had hidden inside with a gun. When Willie entered the room, he shot him in the back of the head. This is where the murderous pair went wrong. After shooting him, he dragged the now-dead masseur to the bathtub and began dismembering him. Throughout the carving of Willie, he kept the water running to keep the blood away. What he didn't realize was that the pipes for the house drained directly into the duck's favorite pond. They'd encased the head in plaster, and when they dumped it into the water, it sank to the bottom. They assumed that without the hard substance, the rest of him would do the same. Mrs. Knack did receive a lighter sentence as part of the deal that required her to testify against Fred Thorne. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison after pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. In 1898, Thorne was sentenced to death by electric chair despite the prosecution's inability to call the duck as a witness. Willie's identity was first revealed by Ned Brown, a reporter who dropped out of medical school after only 1 year. He accepted a permanent position as a reporter for World, from which he would retire after 34 years. What are your thoughts on the vintage case? I really appreciate your input. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Be a part of the Chris Crime Diaries family and hit the subscribe button now.